afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. The saying goes that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So what are two pictures worth? Well, a research project at the University of Vermont is using pictures to help Vermonters understand our changing climate and to develop strategies or best practices to mitigate and adapt to climate changes. The research involves existing photos and photo simulations, which you'll see during today's program. The project is led by two experts in the university's Plant and Soil Science Department. Joining me are Professor Stephanie Hurley, whose research and teaching spans the fields of landscape architecture, ecological design and planning, and alongside Professor Hurley is Holly Greenleaf. Holly is a research assistant and landscape designer in UVM Plant and Soil Science. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now, Stephanie, what's your research project and what are the goals?
Well, our main goal with the research is to explore how landscape visualizations can be used to help Vermont farms be more resilient in the face of climate change. So when we talk about climate change, the strategies we would typically go with are either mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, or both. When we talk about mitigation, we're thinking things like carbon sequestration, planting trees, planting shrubs, basically taking up the carbon dioxide that fossil fuels would emit. And when we're talking about adapting to climate change, it's really what can you do on your land to acknowledge that weather patterns are changing, precipitation conditions are changing, we have more big storms, higher intensity storms, more drought. So what can we do with our land along these lines to adapt to the fact that climate change is coming?
And so, Holly, are you playing a role in helping increase resiliency of Vermont agriculture?
Yes, well, we think that the landscape visualizations have the potential to be a really important tool in increasing the understanding of the spatial components of these best management practices that help farms become more resilient. And so due to their capacity to transfer that information, we think that they could really help in supporting dialogue and decision-making among farmers and researchers and other stakeholders in the context of Vermont agriculture and resilience. And also, it's just kind of another, tool in the toolbox for adaptive management and being able to visualize alternative scenarios for farms and being able to share those visions.
Can we take a look at some?
Yeah, we've got some stills that actually show what we're talking about. Now, what are we seeing here?
So this is an example of a riparian buffer. It's a photo simulation or a visualization. And along the lines of what I was talking about before, they mitigate climate change by having trees and shrubs planted to help sequester carbon, but they also can help stabilize stream banks. So if we look at the existing image of what it looks like now and we compare it side by side with the simulated condition, so above is existing and the simulation is what's proposed, you can see that in this simulated condition, the stream banks would be stabilized by the vegetation, the plants have the opportunity to filter runoff that's coming from the farm fields. Species that live in the river would actually benefit from the shading that the riparian buffer provides. And in the case of showing these to farmers and other stakeholders around Vermont farms, you get a sense of how just talking about it isn't as helpful as seeing the picture and understanding the spatial, the dramatic difference in the spatial qualities of implementing these strategies.
And it answers the question, well, what's that going to look like?
Exactly.
And so where did the idea of using landscape visualizations come from?
Well, the idea actually came from architecture and urban planning and landscape architecture. It's pretty well founded to show alternative future conditions. So for example, showing a community group how different building heights or different construction scenarios might look in a developed landscape, or looking at forest management plans and the consequence that different logging strategies might have on the landscape visually and affecting people's views. Maybe looking at wind turbines and how many on a ridgeline people might be able to tolerate. So it hasn't been as well studied in agriculture. And so we had the opportunity, working with a larger group of researchers at University of Vermont, to use some USDA research dollars and some internal University of Vermont food systems funding to really explore how these visualizations and these techniques might apply to Vermont agriculture, especially looking forward in the climate change context.
All right, I think we have another picture now of a pond.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so these are side-by-side images where above is the existing condition, and the image below actually was created by Holly in our research lab, looking at what would happen to add a retention pond to this site, as well as some vegetation around the edges to do some slope stabilization. So it's a clear difference between the existing and what is proposed, but it helps farmers visualize, well, maybe I actually even have the capacity, the labor, the tools, the equipment on my land to install something like this. Maybe it's not as complicated as I thought. Maybe this area is wet anyway, and it might be the logical place to put in a pond to clean runoff that may be moving downstream and to store water on site.
So Holly, how have you explored the potential use of landscape visualization in agriculture?
So far, the three main ways we've done that is actually developing the image pairs, the photo simulations in Photoshop. Also conducting a survey seeking the input of the responses to those images, and also conducting focus groups to kind of dive deeper and figure out the significance of these.
So tell me what you've heard from farmers in these groups.
Yeah, so far, well, first we created about over 9 photo simulations of different best management practices, including the ones you've seen so far, the retention pond and riparian buffer, and also others including constructed wetlands or silvopasture. And then we've taken this survey to 6 farmer conferences throughout the state over the past year, including Vermont Grain Growers, NOFA, Dairy, Organic Dairy, Vermont Grazers and Livestock, and No-Till and Cover Crop, to kind of get a wide slice of the demographics of Vermont farmers. Mm-hmm. And then we conducted the focus groups with ag service providers and outreach specialists to kind of figure out where these would be useful in using this as a tool in the field of agriculture. Mm-hmm. It was really awesome, the positive feedback that we got at conferences. People were really receptive to the images, and it brought up a lot of great conversations and questions that I don't think normally they would have just by hearing about this best management practices or reading it.
Mm-hmm. And Stephanie, what were some of the highlights or most interesting parts of your research?
I think from a research perspective, just the positive response that Holly just described to all of these visualizations. We really enjoyed hearing back from people that this technology was cool, or that they would want to have a visualization tailored to their own farm. And it really does show that a picture is perhaps worth 1,000 words, or maybe more. We have, as people, we are very visual generally.
Right.
All of us use imagery in our daily lives to navigate space, and especially with complicated topics, changes in the landscape, it really helps to not just have it be a verbal description or reading text, but to show an image of what seems like a familiar Vermont backdrop with the changes applied. Mm-hmm. So that's really important. And we actually asked people, if you look at
in the interest of visuals,
yes, in the interest of visuals, if you look at some of our assessed survey data, we asked people very simply whether the photo simulations helped them to better understand what adaptation on Vermont farms might look like. And after looking at these various visuals, and far and away, you can see they said yes.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah, and we also asked people to compare, seeing the visual versus reading it, or both. And the results were also overwhelmingly positive towards having that visual. And just to be clear, the reading part of it was a little blurb about the best management practice, and it was definitely helpful for people. And but the visual was actually the part of it that really brought up more questions and intrigued people to kind of dig deeper and learn more about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Stephanie, what are the main challenges to farmer adaptation of climate change best management practices?
So the main challenges that arose after looking through our survey results and talking in our focus groups, as well as speaking directly with farmers more casually at conferences, unsurprising, time and money and labor to an extent. So the funds being available to implement some of these strategies and practices, and having enough of a labor force to actually physically do this on the land, as well as the time. But other things that emerged included a lack of full training or education on the subject. So maybe there was interest, but not a complete understanding of exactly what they should do and where. And basically just the need for more education generally and outreach generally. And I would say we thought that perhaps aesthetics would arise as an issue, but it turns out that it didn't. Across our surveys, people love the Vermont pastoral, rural, vernacular landscape, and it works to increase these best management practices on the land and maintain the aesthetic. No one said that they were disruptive to the aesthetics that we know and love.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and also I just want to say, also going back to the conversations I had at the conferences, a really main thought that I found was that farmers' willingness to accept these practices really depends on trust and people-to-people relationships. So farmers need to know that these strategies are going to work for them, and the way that they know that is if it's successful for a neighbor or someone else in the state of Vermont. And, establishing these long-term relationships with ag service providers. And so the photo simulations can be a tool to help with that, but it's really about the relationships that farmers have with other people in the field.
That is very interesting. Now, Stephanie, what do you plan to do with the results?
That's a good question. So right now we are sharing results more broadly with other researchers and people in the farm community, various stakeholders across the Northeast, across Vermont. But we also could see the results going forward to be a farm planning tool. We were surprised by how many people asked us can you come to our farm and do this for my land? Take the picture at my place, and we'll do a visual for it. And it's because people are thinking ahead and they're wanting to plan the future of their farmland. So one other planning tool that's really important to consider is we've been showing these visuals from a human eye perspective view, like a typical photo.
If you're standing on the land.
If you're standing on the land, exactly. So if you look at aerial imagery, by contrast, and there's a nice one on the screen, the existing condition on the left side is a riverside farmland, and the simulation on the right side increases the amount of vegetation in the riparian buffer zone. So as far as a planning tool, farmers could make decisions about do we have trees that are shorter or taller? What would the shadows that they cast be like? How much of my land area, how much acreage would actually be occupied by buffers of different widths, whether they're required by regulation or done voluntarily in the future? Really
because
being able
land
to
that would be taken out of production to accommodate.
It could be taken out of production, although there is some really interesting research developing on productive buffers and the possibility of occasionally going into buffers to harvest other crops, not necessarily corn in the buffer, but things like nuts, berries, some wood products that you could actually plant in the buffer. So there's some cutting-edge research coming soon on that.
Nice. So where do you see the role of landscape visualizations being the most effective as a tool for communication?
So we definitely see it as a very useful tool that could be used by agricultural service providers, such as NRCS agents or extensionists. So using these images, on farm, in the field, when talking with farmers and making these decisions. We also see them eventually developing a user-friendly technology to customize different various future scenarios for farms. And so different customizable features would be like budget or different design routes, or also like evolution through space and time. So comparing a mature riparian buffer to a newly planted one, or various, weather and climate scenarios.
So you could actually see a farmer maybe plugging in this information for his land and then having all these things come up, where to plant, what it's going to look like in 10 years, how effective it's going to be. That's amazing.
Yeah, we hope so.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining me today. It's a fascinating topic and really fun to look at those pictures. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.